Hello, g'day, and good evening, and indeed a very good morning to this live stream here with the Oak Barrel and Barrel Craft Whiskey. My name is Scott Fitzsimons. I look after all the whiskey and spirits here at the Oak Barrel, and indeed that includes Sydney Whisky Fair and Sydney Whisky Forum when we are unable to do that. We're into night 3 of the forum, and this first week, as we sort of said, is our bit of our world tour. We started in England on Tuesday with Bimber. We went around Scotland yesterday with some indie bottlers, and we are now onto the other side of the world in America, and going to try a bunch of whiskies. I've got 6 whiskies here that we sent out packs for around the country from the Barrel suite of whiskies and some of their weirder experiments. But if you didn't manage to get one of those packs that did sell out, feel free to crack something you got at home. Continue to watch, ask some questions and all that sort of thing, because we have a very, very special guest up at Sparrows, if that reference makes the crosses to the America. Will Schragis, who I believe it is officially 6:03 a.m. Where you are. Thanks for getting up and thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I would say good morning and good evening to everyone.
Yeah, and this is part of the theme of the International Week of the Whisky Forum, is that we in Australia, we've finished a hard day of doing whatever we do, and we're ready to drink, and you've just got a full schedule ready to go. So we do apologise, but thank you for setting the alarm clock a little bit earlier.
Nothing to apologise for. I really love meeting and talking to people down in Australia about our product. We just launched there maybe about a year ago, and I just hope one of these months it gets to be a situation where I can come visit.
Yeah, that'd be great. So before we dive in, let's talk a little bit about yourself before we get into the brand. You have the enviable title of Chief Product Innovation Officer. I'm not really sure what that means, but it sounds really cool. But you, prior to that, to this, and you do a little some things outside of Barrel in terms of education and in lecturing and that sort of stuff. But you've worked in retail, you've worked extensively across rum and wine and that sort of stuff. So you've done a lot of things. But what was it that found you landed Barrel in 2016?
Yeah, so I met Joe Beatrice, the owner and founder of Barrel, in 2014 when he was selling Barrel Bourbon Batch 1. And he was really a one-man show at the time. He was doing everything himself. And I was working for a retail and auction house in New York called Zacky's. And I was, I think, the second buyer to bring Barrel Bourbon into a store or restaurant. And we just sort of got along. We struck up conversation. Joe's vision from the very beginning was that, and he was ahead of his time, but luckily for us as a company, only a couple years ahead of his time, that you could run a company with only limited single release offerings, that he could do cask strength one-time blends and maintain growth as a whiskey producer or a bourbon producer in America. And even though there's a little bit of a model of that with indie bottlers in Scotland, there really wasn't anyone doing it well or honestly in America at the time. And I, having come out of the fine wine side and really enjoying indie bottled Scotch and whiskey and rum at the time, just like sort of fell in love with the model. And I was 25, and essentially Joe said, I'd like to keep talking to you, and one day when I'm ready to take this into at least a national brand, I want you to work for me. So I sort of nodded my head and accepted the free dinners when he was asking me questions about whiskey. I went on to go work for what was then called the House of Agricole, and it's now called Spiribomb, that does Rum Clement and Rum JM, Rum Damoiseau, Chairman's Reserve, and had a really amazing time doing distribution management and some brand ambassador work for them. And then a year and a half later, Joe stayed true to his word and said, I'm ready. Pick a title. Tell me which state you want to launch first. And at that point, it was me and Joe and Tripp, who's our master blender, and Katie, Joe's daughter, who does all of our graphic design and website design. And since then, the team we're up to about 36 people now. Joe's wife is our head of marketing now, but then there's quite a lot of people that aren't related to Joe too. And we just keep growing, and every year is a new challenge. And for me, every year is a new set of whiskeys that we get to design. We have a little bit more of a core portfolio now, which I know we're going to taste through quite a bit of it, but we still are really dedicated to to keeping people on their toes and pushing the idea of what high quality whiskey in America, but now the world is like.
Yeah, excellent. I think it's really fascinating, and I think it's important for a company like Barrel to not only understand the company but also the structure of it and the people who work for it, because I think you taste your hands, for lack of a better phrase, in those whiskies. Just want to quickly jump in terms of a lineup tonight. I know that if we don't get a whiskey into people's glasses, people will start virtually throwing things at me and sending me emails. So is there a whiskey that while we start talking, you wouldn't mind kicking off with tonight?
Yeah, I actually think we should start with Bourbon Batch 27.
Yep.
All of these are cask strength, and with the exception of the Infinite Barrel Project, none of them have any peat in them. And so even though the Infinite Barrel Project is the least expensive in the lineup, I think maybe we should do it last. It's a little bit harder to go from peat to non-peat. I prefer to do things as sort of comparable as possible next to each other. And so if we do the first two the bourbons first, and then we move into the more exotic finishes, and then we can move into peat at the end.
Yeah, beauty. Just a tiny bit of housekeeping. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, a bit of scratchiness on something there. If that's just me.
No, I think it's my mic hitting my collar.
Yeah.
So I just have to lean forward a little bit.
Yeah, I feel like we might have had this last time we were sitting in the Oak Barrel tasting room. But excellent. Now, this is something I want to bring up, and it's excellent you've chosen batch 27 of bourbon first. And I was listening very carefully to how you described Barrel, and you sort of, particularly in the early days, you said barrel bourbon and that sort of thing. But Barrel is more than just a bourbon company. It's more than just a bourbon and rye whiskey producer. But I think sometimes, even though it's got a nice big B on the logo, the word, Barrel starts with a B. Do you find sometimes that you get lumped into being a bourbon bottler when really you do a range of whiskeys?
Yeah, but a little bit by design or by our own history of doing. Our company was called Barrel Bourbon for the first 4 years or so of the company. We now call ourselves Barrell Craft Spirits because we work in so many different categories. But we sort of joke internally that bourbon is our vodka because it sells itself and it keeps the lights on. I would say I spend about a quarter of my time answering questions about rye and other non-bourbon whiskeys, and about a quarter of my time answering questions about our pretty extensive cask strength rum portfolio. But 80% of what we sell is still bourbon. And so you're right. I should refer to this as Barrel Bourbon Batch 27 because we don't have any batches that are outside of the bourbon category at the moment. We've gotten a little bit sloppy with our category naming when we refer to the batches of bourbon. We, for a long time, did batches of rye as well, and we did one batch of rum. But with the introduction of Dovetail and Armida and Seagrass, except for the bourbon category, we've moved away from the batch numbers in other categories, and we've started to focus more on really nailing those flavor profiles over and over again, and then using the private release line, which is a set of micro blends we do in the whiskey world. In the whiskey side, each one has a different finish, and we use that for the really sort of sexy experimentation that we do. And as we find things that we really like in that, we slowly migrate them into the Dovetail Armida Seagrass line, which we refer to as the evergreen line, because even though they're blended in different vattings and the proof changes, it's always the same finishes on them.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, let's dig into this. I guess there's an element of, this was the bread and butter of the company. This is where it sort of all started, is playing with bourbon. This is, batch 27. The youngest in it is about 5 years old, but there's a lot of older stuff in it. When you're creating a batch of bourbon, and when you're creating 28 or 30 or 31 or whatever it is do you have a flavor profile in mind, or is it very much what the barrels are doing will dictate what you come up with?
So we don't have a specific flavor profile in mind, but we do have sort of plans about which barrels we're going to use as the base of each batch. When we're looking at our portfolio or stock of empty but mature but available barrels, we have to plan out a little bit which sets are going to be the bases of certain things. Even though our company is still a small independent producer, the batches of bourbon are reasonably large blends at this point. So we have to make sure that there's 20 or 30 or 50 or 70 barrels of something that can be the focal point or the sort of core on which we can attach other profiles to. So usually what we'll do is we'll do some just specific tasting of different lots we have, and then we'll do one pretty major vatting of barrels, and we will use that as the base when we're doing our lab blending to help develop the rest of the flavor profile. Similarly, even though we work with 78 different distilleries at this point, there are certain distilleries and mash bills and ages and sets of barrels that we are very deep on, and we know how they play with each other and with other things pretty well. So even if there's we really want to let the barrels drive the flavor. Trip always says the flavor, who's driving the flavor bus. We want to always be like working to make something as good as it can possibly be, because we have the challenge, but also like leisure of not having a specific flavor profile to have to nail every time we're blending. So we don't know what the end's going to be like, but we usually know where we're starting. 27 for us was one of the blends we did that uses some wheated bourbon in it. And so even though the wheated bourbon is not the core of batch 27, we knew that we had to put a base together that was not so assertive that it wouldn't overpower the really sort of sweet, white, flowery wheat component. And so the discussion about how to create a like intriguing but gentle base for 27 was kind of where we started on it. And to be totally honest, I don't get to say this all that often, 27 was my favorite batch we've done in the last year.
Yeah, right. And I mean, it's an interesting, you touched upon it earlier, like being a company that can get away with doing cask strength releases, doing, batch releases, say, 27 is your favorite. Once it's gone, it's gone. You know what I mean? Like you can't go back and do that. For us in the Australian market, we obviously don't, have this insight, but is American market adaptive to that? Like, is that something that they take and run with? Or, do you feel like, in some of the other things we're going to get to, that consistency is still very important?
So I think what has allowed our company to be successful is our dedication to the parts of the consuming market that do appreciate that and want something new all the time. And it is a lot of work to always be having to be careful about innovating correctly and maintaining or improving upon the level of quality we're putting out. With each batch, not only is there putting the blend together, but there's the label design and the cola design, and frankly, the logistics of 50 different states, each with their own sets of laws, to launch legally a new product every time, even if it's a continuation of the same series. And we find in the bourbon world in America, there's a lot of people who want to try something new and high quality. And especially for us, even though our whiskeys are not cheap, over delivering at the price point is something we talk about every time we're starting a new blend. We taste these things next to Booker's while we're making them, for instance, and we want to make sure that if someone is going to invest in our reasonably expensive whiskey, that they're going to be excited about the bottle that they bought for that much money when it's our bottle. As we have grown and the reality of being a national brand has set in, there's certain situations that need products that are always available because, for instance, you apply 6 months out in certain states to have state registered listings. So we can just apply with barrel bourbon batch blank and see if we get a listing, but we're less likely to get that approval if we don't have the specific details of the product that will be available in 6 months. Yeah, right. So with Dovetail or Meter and Seagrass, it's at least a foot in the door in those places.
Yeah.
But that being said, like you, I don't want to say that I understand the Australian whiskey market at all. The American whiskey market has a lot of really lazy producers. And so trying to push something that people have had for a long time over and over again, it's not nearly as fun is trying to push something new and exciting. And I think I really love working with our small but really dynamic, hardworking sales team, because we attract people who want to constantly have to learn about new things internally and then talk about new things. It's really nice to work for a company where every time you walk into a bar or in a store, or every time I talk to you, I've got something new to talk about. If we had the same 5 things every time, it would be a stretch to try to be interviewed, but instead I just get to answer honestly about the new things whenever you ask me.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, and that, that's it, isn't it? At the heart of it, you're a whiskey fan who, was poached from another gig essentially. So, and that's sort of what I was, touching upon at the start. You don't, I think Barrel is, as this community, as this collective, at least that's how it looks like from an outsider's point of view. Understanding that makeup is really, really important.
Yeah. Our blending team is 4 people, and it's fun for me. I have the sexy title when you introduced me of Chief Product Innovation Officer, but I really manage sort of like 2 departments at the company now. The first is working with Joe on the conceptual design of products. So talking about what type of whiskey are we trying to give someone with a finished rye, and because of that, what name Seagrass can communicate that, and what finishes that we've worked with do we think are worth testing on Canadian rye or Indiana rye, and what will work well together. But Joe and Tripp, we call him the chief whiskey scientist, he's the master blender, and Nick Christensen, who we call the assistant blender, but really is just like a different side of the blending team with Tripp. She also manages the single barrel program. I'm not in Kentucky all the time the way they are, and so the actual trial and error and fabrication of these things really falls on the 3 of them. I just get the sexy title because I have to make people excited to interview me. And so each one of us came to it from very different places, and we have different strengths and weaknesses and skill sets in terms of like trying to come out with whiskeys that not only taste great, but also communicate from the very beginning to the very end of the experience what we were trying to go for. Tripp comes from the bourbon world, and he worked for Jack Daniels as a distiller. Tripp can smell something blind no matter what the age is, and can usually tell you like the yeast strain that was used to ferment it when in the bourbon world. Nick came from the very, very high-end cocktail and beverage direction world, and Nick and I, because we worked in categories that were not whiskey for so long, when Joe completely takes the leash off and lets us think about what we want to do, that's when things like partnering with a Barolo producer to do different cru finishes on the same whiskey starts to take shape.
Yeah.
Joe, who's been around whiskey and the spirits world for so long, but didn't come out of the spirits world, but has such a specific vision and palate, having a single person who ultimately says yes or no to everything that leaves the facility is how we are able to take such a complicated, large portfolio of releases and still have some level of cohesiveness to them, that there's still one perspective that's the arbiter of everything we do. So there is a lot of Joe telling me, Nick, and Tripp to go work on our thing, and then some yes and knowing from him at the end. But in order to get something that we all agree on as finished, it needs to sort of check the classic bourbon rye box for Tripp. It needs to check the is it interesting box flavor profile wise for Nick. It needs to check the like is this product saying what we needed it to say box for me. And then ultimately needs to check the like do I feel good about this holistically box for Joe.
Yeah, right. All right. Well, let's look at this 27 in depth. Now, you mentioned it had a bit of a bit of a core that you built upon. It's coming from 5, 6, 8, 9, 13, and 15-year-old bourbons going into there from across Tennessee, Kentucky, and Indiana. On the nose, this is everything bourbon should be for me. I mean, again, I'm sort of seeing things from the outside being an Australian and not being there, but I felt there's been a really big, the recent interest in bourbon in the past decade or so, has been fueled a lot by the interest in people, pushing back to big, robust bourbons, sort of that pre-prohibition style that, was largely lost, but then sometimes going too far with the elements of heat and spice and strength for the sake of that. And this is a muscular, really robust nose whiskey. The palate's got heaps of structure, but it's so elegant and refined at the same time. So, I mean, is that, without giving away the trade secrets, is that like the older, 13 and 15s giving that salt and pepper spice, in terms of salt and pepper in practice rather than the flavors of salt and pepper, I should say, to dish out that muscular? Is that sort of, am I on the right track there?
Yeah, I think to some extent, yes. There's definitely a dustier, more savory quality that you get from the oxidativeness of just old spirits in general. There's molecules that have oxidized or fallen apart into different flavonoids that take time, that there's no way to speed that up. I think there's a lot of noise in the whiskey world right now about accelerated aging, and you can extract wood fast, but you can't necessarily mellow lignin from the wood very faster. At the same time, there's levels of detail or nuance to blending things of different ages that have to do with the solubility of flavor molecules in either alcohol or water. And so it's not just how old is the bourbon, it's how old is the water component of the bourbon and how old is the alcohol component of the bourbon within a barrel. A older low proof barrel and an older high proof barrel will show very differently. And same thing for younger whiskey too. And so I think one of the challenges in building the base of 27 for us was we really love this like 5 to 10 very Indiana driven base profile. But Indiana whiskey, and I'll say MGP, it's just, because we are blending with it, MGP doesn't like us to use their name if it's not 100% from them, is essentially the like gentleman's agreement with them.
Is that for most distilleries as well? I mean, there's a question from Vidal in the chat there, friend of the stream, friend of the Oak Barrel, and I know a friend of Barrel. But is that sort of with all your distilleries? You sort of keep away from naming them because it becomes a barrel product away from those distilleries?
Every partnership we have has slightly different structure, and so there are certain distilleries that we buy barrels directly from. There are certain distilleries that we buy barrels through a broker who buys very, very large lots and then sort of moves them to different other companies or indie bottlers. And there's certain distilleries that we buy from brokers that have owned for a long time. So there's two non-disclosures in place. There was a non-disclosure when the broker bought them and non-disclosure when we bought them. So every partnership, every situation, every set of barrels is a little bit different. For us, we rely so heavily on all of the ability to source interesting distillate from different places that we just want to be really respectful to the really amazing producers that make our company possible. Similarly, we don't really want to be seen as an independent bottler the way that a Gordon MacPhail or a Signatory or a Blackadder is seen, because we don't really want people to see our products as worth tasting based on the provenance of the distillery. We want people to understand how much work we put into making them our own. And so there's a mix of the things we've signed, the like level of respect for not wanting to represent someone else's distillate that doesn't taste like their distillate anymore. But also from a branding perspective, we really want people to think of these as barrel bourbon. We don't want them to think of them as something else in this bottle. So I have to be pretty careful about which things I say out loud, either because we have a non-disclosure in place or because in certain situations, people don't know that we have the barrels that we're using. MGP is a really good example of, they don't care about anyone using their name. Their rule is you can't put it on the bottle if it's not something that they feel is representing their whiskey, and it doesn't from us because it tastes so different. It's blended with so many different things.
Yeah, 100%. No, I think it's fascinating the way that works, and it's a bit of an uncharted territory in America for what you guys are doing. So you're sort of trailblazers in that sense, and I'm sure there will be lots come after you, and will thank you if not overtly for the work you're doing in figuring all of this tough stuff out. That's a stunner. That 27. That is high-end premium bourbon. I mean, that's what it tastes like. That's what it smells like. The finish is just so luscious is perhaps the wrong word, but it's just so generous in the way it keeps giving and giving without being overstated.
Mhm.
I think that's an absolute cracker, and I can see why it's your favorite. I've tried a few of these batches. I think I've tried 4 all up now. So certainly not the full gamut, but I'd probably agree with you so far. This is my favorite of the bourbon batches that I've been lucky enough to try.
Yeah, I think what Joe, Nick, and Trip did so beautifully with 27 is the younger part of that base, the 5 and some of the 6-year-olds, are that 99% corn Indiana bourbon, which is pretty one-dimensional, but it also matures really quickly. So you get a really luscious, sweet corn note from it, but then it stops. The much older barrels, the 15-year-old, is low-proof Tennessee, which is extremely soft and extremely fruit-forward, even though it's old. And so it mellows out and brings some complexity and some fruitiness into that really corn-forward, one-dimensional, younger Indiana. That provides a base for them to take really assertive, to some extent out of balance barrels in the mid-age point ranges that bring one specific note and are only 1 or 2% of the blend in the end, because it was a single barrel or a few barrels that really were showing that way. And it takes something that might not have been good whiskey by itself and allows it to play a really important role in the blend, because they could make the volume up with just such a kind of objectively delicious, if not unique, set of the young and the old blended together. And though that's not the way that we construct every batch, it is a way that we have learned is a really good starting point when we have just small odds and ends barrels that we know are going to make really good ingredients in a larger project.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I mean, I could sit on that all night, but and I do have all night, but you don't have all morning, so we should probably move on. What would you like to do second in the lineup?
I think we should do the single barrel second, if that's okay with you.
Yep. So this is a quite a special release, bottled for our friends at Barrel and Batch, which is a bit of a whiskey co-op that pull their funds together and buy whiskies from all over the world. There's been things that are there's been American whiskies, there's been Scotch, there's been whiskies come out of France and that sort of thing. So there's no real theme to. If you're an Australian consumer and you see the word Barrel and Batch, there's no real theme apart from just excellent whiskeys, and often on the full of flavor side, just because that's their sort of penchant. So, I mean, this is, this sort of single barrel selection, is this common? Are you doing a lot of these at the moment?
Not a lot compared to the way like a Four Roses might be doing it, and not a lot compared to the rest of our portfolio. I also just want to correct on this slide. This is an 100% single barrel. It's a 13-year-old. It's not a blend of anything. When we put the moniker single barrel on a bottle, we take that really seriously. Even though there's some loopholes that you can, there's some companies that can use a loophole to blend something, put it back into a barrel, and then bottle it and say it's a single barrel. We would never do that.
Yeah, so that's my
no,
mistake.
No, there's no problem. I just wanted to. We have a line that we call private release bourbon, which are bespoke, specific, roughly 180 bottle blends that we make. And so it's no problem at all. I just want to clarify that to people. I don't want anyone at any point to think that we are one of the companies that's pulling the wool over people's eyes on single barrels in that way.
No, I think that's a copy and paste error that I've just forgotten to fact check in my quick look through on this.
No problem. But anyway, this barrel, the way that our single barrel program works is as we are dumping for blends, there are certain barrels that stick out to Joe, Nick, and Trip for different reasons, either because they're spending some time looking for them, or there's been a couple of moments where something is like about to get rolled over to be dumped and it smells really good, or they open it up and it's a very short fill barrel and they know the flavor profile is going to be different, and they just pull it off the line and they use chalk to mark it, and it gets moved into consideration for the single barrel program. This particular one was a set of really high Rick single barrels of Tennessee bourbon. If you remember in batch 27, there was a 13-year-old component. That was a vatting of this set of barrels. So this was one of the barrels that was picked out, not necessarily out of batch 27 specifically, but out of the dumping of that set of barrels to vat that ended up getting used as a component in 27 as well. What the D series had that made us really excited was they're reasonably high proof. They're pretty high proof for Old Tennessee bourbon, and they are extremely powerful in their flavor profile. The reason I really like doing a batch and then a single barrel one next to each other is you really get to see the difference between what a lot of different concepts together do and one very singular powerful idea as a single barrel does. And I'm not sure what it's like in Australia, but in America there's this huge thirst for single barrel bourbon right now, and I think it's somewhat misunderstood because it is by definition not as complex as a really well constructed blend, because there just can't be as many flavor profiles in it. There might be a honey barrel, something that's really sweet. There might be a barrel that's extremely balanced. There might be a barrel that the flavors that are in it meld really well together, or it expresses something really specific and wonderful. But it's more about a singular idea that you really liked rather than is this batch constructed well? And so I, as much as I would have loved to taste through this with you, I've got a long day ahead of me. So I passed on the 6 cast strength whiskeys at 6 a.m. But I'm curious on what your thoughts are after tasting a batch that uses this set as a component and then having this. Do you feel like you can taste the flavor from the batch in this particular expression?
Look, I'm going to sit here and pretend to be an expert and say yes. I think I'm cheating a little bit the power of perception now that I know it. I'm sort of looking for it, and I think that's really important in appreciating whiskey. But there are certainly a lot of similarities between it. I think, the 27. I was sort of falling in love with that luscious, big, juicy nose, that very well-rounded thing, which is probably coming from a little bit of those younger, elements. I think the palate on this particularly has that austereness that sort of carries through that the 27 had as well. So there's certainly like similarities, and just like that really gentle baking spice thing at the end, which I'm picking up, which is really cool. But I mean, it's really interesting something you said there. Your single barrel will never ever be the as complex as a really well put together blend, and it's a fascinating thing because in the Australian market, we're a very young industry in the modern Australian whiskey industry. And next week, we're all doing Australian panels, and that's a big thing. Pretty much every night, we're talking about blending because we've gone through that phase of single barrels are king and everything is great, single barrel this, single barrel that. And now distillers are starting to have to learn it. And I think there's been this conception where, because there's been a proliferation of maybe blends that have been a bit dull and a bit boring, that single barrels have been the interesting one. Is that something you see in America as well? Are you having to retrain people to say a really well constructed blend is actually, a sum more of its parts than a single barrel could be?
I like saying that, and it is my goal that people understand that to some extent. But there's also a lot of danger in blending in that when you have a single barrel, if there is a little bit of something interesting that happened in the life of that barrel, most likely the molecules that are giving you that aroma or that flavor or the combinations of them are above what is called perception threshold. It means that like the human body and existence can notice the beautiful thing that smells like peach pie in the single barrel. That is not a linear thing. It's not like you get more peach pie if you get more of those molecules. It's the fact that they exist in a percentage that you can perceive. And there's a lot of times that if you blend that with 1 or 2 other barrels, you might keep a lot of the flavors that you have in it, but there might be certain things that just fall under the human perception threshold. So when you're putting a blend together, if you have a lot of barrels that are a little bit interesting and you blend them all together, you might lose the one interesting thing about all of the barrels and you wind up with a very flat blend. And so to me, it is not a quality situation. It's are you thinking of a barrel as an ingredient, or are you thinking of a barrel as a finished product when you're deciding whether to blend it or not? And with a lot of young distilleries, with a lot of young producers, the single barrels are more interesting to start because there's a lot of variability when you're a small distillery. And there's a lot of didn't necessarily nail it barrels that come out that need to get used. And so you wind up with only the really extreme flavors being the drivers of the blends, whereas the single barrels all have their own character. For us, what is unique is that because we use different distilleries in our blends, there are always very different flavor profiles going into a batch. And so our single barrels, to me, are more about power and less about complexity. But in certain situations, the single barrels might be more complex because there's more little bits of things that will get lost in a blend that show in the single barrel world. What I'm glad to hear is happening in Australia is, as a blender, either you can be in a position where you just have to dump all the barrels together, or you can be in a position where you have a lot of things at your disposal and you can make something that no one barrel ever could be. And that's where I think the most creative whiskeys come, because there's a level of artistry that you're allowed to do. And in a single barrel, like, ultimately you smell it and you taste it and you point at it and that's the end. And so I'm glad that's happening in Australia. I wouldn't say that we have to retrain in any way in America, but I do see a little bit, and I'm hoping it continues. The idea that single barrels are higher quality is a ceiling I'd like to break. They're more collectible, but they're just different. They're not lower quality. It's just a different type of production when you're bottling things in single barrels. You don't have anything to hide behind with a single barrel, but you also limit yourself a little bit with, you're not allowed to like tweak it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these are, as you mentioned, these are premium bourbons we're tasting tonight, and I'm loving that we're getting a premium tasting as well. I hope the people watching this are appreciating, because these, like, your views are from a completely different angle to what your standard distillery with a team line is sort of talking about. So I'm fascinated by this. One thing just before we move on this one, you mentioned, when you're dumping barrels to sort of make blends and things stand out, do you sort of put them aside? Like, say the Oak Barrel, and everyone watching on the stream, we go, well, definitely for Whiskey Fair 2022, we need to do a barrel single cast. And we go, we approach you guys. Do you then go looking for something, or do you have a series of barrels going, put aside, we're going to use that for something either for ourselves or someone in the future?
So with the barrel line, we actually pre-bottle single barrels. When we find them and we like them, we name them, we set them aside, and then once every 2 months or so, we'll go and we'll bottle 60 or 80 single barrels. And so the sticker, the selected by sticker, is applied after bottling for the barrel line. And that is just a production logistics situation, that the idea of you want something and we need to get it to you. We do all of our own bottling in-house, and the days and the weeks that we're bottling single barrels are a very different type of bottling production, because each one has its own label, and that the barrels need to be brought into the bottling room in the order with which we need to bottle them, and they need to come to a temperature with which we can bottle them, because they're usually aging at not the temperature they have to be bottled. When we do things at cask strength, if we bottle it at the wrong temperature, it's going to change volumes in the bottle quite a bit when it gets to room temperature, and it's going to either cause cork problems or look like a short fill bottle. So there's just some like production logistics that go into single barrels that gets really complicated. And so as we are noticing them, we set them aside, and then a month or two later, we bottle all of them.
Yeah. Okay.
But that actually helps us too, because if someone needs a single barrel for an event, we usually have a couple on hand that are not selected yet that we can offer them.
Yeah. I want to echo a comment here from Glenn, who's coming with beautiful and smooth. And I think at a base level, they're two of the best things you could say about a whiskey, and develop. And I think we've had two excellent starts here into bourbons, two straight bourbons that sort of sum up. Okay, Barrell Craft Spirits, as you know now, that they do the classics very, very well. And I think you need to be able to do that. If you're a burger store and you got a very, very special burger with all sorts of exotic ingredients, that's great. But if you can't do a cheeseburger right, then, okay, maybe need to look at yourselves. So
no, I feel the same way, that I really judge producers of all things in the beverage world by how well executed their simple products are, not necessarily how exciting their complicated products are. When I go to a brewery, for instance, the thing that I most want to try is the pale ale. I know that you can put together a 70 IBU
Pineapple
IPA, and
infused
and
ice
yeah,
cream.
and if you like that flavor profile, you're gonna like it. But there's a lot to hide behind there, and it's really hard to hide behind like a single or a pale ale.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing goes for whiskey companies. If you look at that, even the great Scotch houses of the world, what's their core initial offering? The reason I love Talisker is because I love Talisker 10. Of course, Talisker 30 is going to be delicious unless they really screw it up. But the base distillate is really wonderful too. And so for us, as we're about to get into some really cool blends that we're talking about, but we need to make sure that we are really good at producing all of the things that go into secondary maturation, because that blend is only going to be good if the very beginning of it was good too.
Yeah, excellent. And speaking of which, let's get a little bit weird. Let's get a little bit crazy. What would you like to do next?
I think we should go to Armida next, because all of the base whiskeys of Armida started as bourbon. So if we're going to do our best to keep this a linear tasting, we went bourbon, and now finished bourbon.
Yeah, which is a bit of a new concept. We're seeing, certain brands with, quite linear product lines in finished bourbon arrive, and this is obviously a bit of an extreme thing. Is finished bourbon, popping up as often as we seem to think it is?
Yes, especially in the more exploratory, higher end releases, either from small new companies or even from some of the larger companies that are testing new things. I personally would call this a whiskey that uses bourbon as components. I am a traditionalist in that I feel the canon of bourbon, even if legally you can call something a finished bourbon, the minute it goes into a secondary maturation cask, it sort of breaks the spirit of the law of what bourbon is. That being said, you can see on the label of Dovetail, it sort of hints at that same red that we use in the bourbon world. All of the bases of this were blends of bourbon that we did.
I'm just going to zoom in on that label a little bit so people can see it a bit better. But yeah, it does say bourbon whiskey finished in pear brandy, rum, and Sicilian Amaro casks. Now, if I'd said that sentence out aloud about 10 years ago, people probably would have thrown things at me.
Yeah, I think 10 years ago, I don't even think it exists yet. Maybe 6 years ago, you had the Dalmore cigar malt that had a bunch of different finishes on it, and you had the Bruichladdich Black Art that had a bunch of different finishes on it, and you had the Auchentoshan Triple Wood. And those are all in the Scotch world, and those are the only three finish. Oh, you know what? Actually, Bushmills 21 has 3 finishes on it too. So I take that back. Scotch and Irish. There definitely was no one in America doing something like this at the time. More and more it is happening, but I think that our what we call evergreen line that all have 3 finishes on them is probably the most complicated on paper and definitely the most complicated logistically to produce set of core offerings that exist in the whiskey world. Armida is a blend of 3 different bourbons finished separately. The first in Jamaican rum casks, which give it that like sort of funk that you get pretty quickly. The second in Sicilian Amaro barrels. They're barrels that are neutral that we condition with Sicilian Amaro in our facility, and then we put bourbon into. And the third, though it is, I think, the sort of the leading horse, especially on the nose, if not on the palate, is the pear brandy finish. What was a fun challenge for us for this product specifically is when we did the testing and the concept blend, we had a pear brandy barrel that we really loved. And that was the reason, that was the impetus for making Armida. What we learned pretty quickly when we wanted to scale upward into a national release is pear brandy casks are very, very variable. And a lot of pear brandy producers don't want to give their barrels up because they want neutral wood on them. So they want to keep them over and over again. So we ended up partnering with 7 different farm distilleries in America to source off the still-proof pear eau de vie, which we then age in French oak for about 6 months. we dump the eau de vie out into another barrel, and then we put the bourbon in. So there's no way to quantify it for sure, but my understanding is we are the largest consumer of pear eau de vie in America now, only to condition the barrels for this one product that we make. So we actually created a whole subdivision of wood management in our company for us to be able to create the tools that we need to make this product consistent.
It's I mean, it's working. Whatever you're doing, I mean that nose is just so crisp and bright, if for lack of a better word. It's a really clear nose, and I certainly get a big, pear lashing through that. You've mentioned, you mentioned Talisker as one of your loves. You've talked about the cask finishes. Do you guys take, inspiration from, Scotch whiskey in terms of what you're doing?
I think, yes, for everyone that's on the blending team, we all have our own inspirations for things that we really love. Joe is inspired by a couple of different sort of unrelated pieces in the whiskey industry. I think that Booker's, for instance, was always an inspiration for him because he loves cask strength, and Booker's was just unabashedly cask strength from the very beginning. But I think also Compass Box in Scotland has always been a little bit of an inspiration for us because they're so willing to give the middle finger to the rest of the industry if there's something they want to do. And working for and alongside Joe has taught me so much about figure out what you want to do, that you believe in, that customers will like, do it well, and then stick up for yourself when people are criticizing you in whatever way. And if the product is good, people are going to defend you. We don't have to defend ourselves very often. I'm sure there's people watching this that go on Reddit and the other bourbon forums, and we are one of the brands that like gets a lot of hate and a lot of love. Not very many people who are into whiskey have no opinion about us. And I've really learned from Joe is like, if you keep your head down and make the whiskey good, you don't have to fight about why you did it anymore. If you make, I don't know, Tabasco finished whiskey, you have to fight why you did it because doesn't taste good. And so we've just learned like Barrell is a wonderfully sort of quiet, apolitical brand in terms of the way that we talk about what we're doing, because we just want to focus on making the whiskey really good. And so I think Compass Box has always been an inspiration for us in that. There's just brands and people that are so specific about their vision for what they want to do. I, of course, have producers like Talisker as an example, but I think Wild Turkey would be an example too, that like, I really like the distillate. I really like the consistency, and I really like that they don't stray too far from what made them what they are. To me, what bothers me about producers is when they either don't treat the people that work for them well, or they're disingenuous about what they are. So if you're a new producer, own being a new producer. Don't pretend that you dug a recipe out of your uncle's boot from 1941, unless you did, but I've never heard of someone really doing that. Similarly, if you are doing something well for the entirety of your existence, do it really well, and then be honest about the experiments that you're doing. I think that there's a misnomer in the backside of the whiskey world that people think consumers aren't going to understand things or are going to believe them. And the truth is that the whiskey drinking consumers around the world are like a lot smarter than most people in my position give them credit for. And so we try really hard always to just like innovate and be creative, and then want people to have opinions about it. I hope that you have some things that you like and dislike in this tasting, because they're really different whiskeys. If you like all of them equally, you just like whiskey at that point. It's not that you have a specific opinion on any of them. Anyway, I think I digressed to the point where I forgot the original question.
No, but that's good. I actually just caught a sight of the time. We've been going for 51 minutes so far, and I was like, it feels like we've been talking for 15 minutes, which is great. But I love to hear that. And again, I'm not as clued up as what's going on in America, but in Australia, historically, there's been battle lines. I'm a bourbon drinker, or I'm a Scotch drinker, and family Christmas is, ruined because someone brings a bourbon instead of a Scotch, or vice versa type thing. And it's insane. It's madness. If you like one, there's you like the other. And these sort of things, this cross-pollination, there's certainly things that Scotch could learn from bourbon. And then, just hearing you go, well, actually, we looked at some of these brands and said, we can learn from what they're doing, I think is excellent as well. I think, not enough of that is going on. And I'm sure it is more than I know.
Yeah, I think that everyone can kind of learn from each other, or what you can do is you can learn from and you can admire one specific thing that you think someone's doing really well, and you can try to see why it's working for them and do your version of it.
Yeah.
If you want to move on, because I know we're having time constraints, I would say the next thing would be Dovetail.
Dovetail, which I think was one of the runaway favorites, and I'm going to speak completely out of turn here, but say that this was the quickest to sell out of the first barrel imports into Australia. It's probably the most popular release. Certainly, it's the one that's hardest to keep on oak barrel shelves, and it has just come back in. So I'll zoom in on the label for this one as well, because this doesn't have the word bourbon on it. We've got whiskey here finished in rum, port, and Dun Vineyard Cabernet barrels.
Right. So Dovetail is our top selling item now, even though we say that we're a bourbon company. And if you add up all the bourbons together, bourbon is still the major part of our sales mix, for lack of a better term. But Dovetail as a specific SKU is the one that we produce the most of and sell the most of. This is a whiskey because the base of it is an Indiana whiskey. The distillate went into used barrels, not new oak. And it is then transferred in our warehouse into Dun Vineyard's Cabernet barrels. Dun Vineyard's being one of the really OG, respected old Napa Cabernet producers. The other two ingredients started as bourbon. They are bourbon finished in late bottle vintage port pipes and blackstrap molasses rum barrels. Dovetail is a high proof whiskey, and because not all of it was bourbon, there was less wood sugar and a little bit less tannin on the base blends. But that blackstrap molasses rum cask, which brings a lot of funk and a lot of earthiness, but also some residual sugar, and the late bottle vintage port pipes, which bring a lot of fruitiness but bring a lot of residual sugar into it. Those two ingredients are out of balance on purpose when we produce them. They're too syrupy and opulent, and they balance out the otherwise very abrasive, dry Cabernet finish on a whiskey. So I think what I love so much about Dovetail, beyond the fact that it was really the first blend that we made that challenged how much detailed information you can put on a label and still have people see it as like one cohesive thing. Dovetail was the impetus for Armida and for Seagrass. But what I really love about Dovetail is it is objectively easy to drink and delicious and flavorful. You don't need to take it that seriously. It's the first thing that I recommend to people if they want an idea of what we do on our discovery side and our cask finishing side. I'm just really proud of it as a whiskey, and I understand and agree with how it was sort of the first to sell out. It is a unique product, but it's very much something that I think it has the body of a bourbon, but the sort of complexity and lack of just pure American oak that some other world whiskeys have. And so it's a good bridge whiskey for people that are interested in different categories.
Really creamy. Even on the nose, haven't even tasted this yet, but super creamy, super inviting, wants to drag me in. But when you say creamy, you often, the word vanilla comes, pretty straight after, and that's there, but it's not overpowering. This isn't like nosing vanilla essence. For the eagle-eyed amongst us, they might have noticed that the bottle that I showed, it's on the slide there, is 62.35, 124.7 proof. The one we're actually drinking is a different batch. 61.45, so 122.9 proof. This is a relatively, your evergreen sort of series, but this would still move in batches. So does it tend to hang around within like a percentage or two, or like how do the batches work?
Yeah, so we just, for clarity's sake, internally, we don't refer to the Dovetail or Armida or Seagrass vattings as batches. To us, a batch of bourbon is when we start from the beginning and we have a new concept. We call them vattings. Not that you have to do that, but it just helps us not confuse ourselves internally. If you want to zoom in really far on the label again, if you can zoom in on the right side of the label where the two colors meet.
Sort of here.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's about as far as
zoom in?
I can go at the moment.
Okay. If you can't do it, don't worry about it. But I'm also very impressed with your ability to tech this in the last minute. There's a little number there. In the bottle you're holding, you might be able to see it.
Yes, it's number 5, and I'm going to stand up and I'm going to switch the screens and see if this camera will grab this. I dare say it's not going to, but bear with me.
I don't think it's going to get it. That is our place. We keep that small on purpose because we don't want to call attention to it.
There's definitely a number 5 there.
Okay. That is our place to Easter egg which vatting of Dovetail it is. So what you have in front of you is the 5th vatting of Dovetail. The reason we do that is because
that's not working.
Yeah, sorry, I should have warned you that. Now you know for the next time. We blend Dovetail blind to taste, so we're more concerned with the flavor profile being true to what Dovetail is, and also making it as good as we can. We're not trying to nail the proof every time. It would be very difficult for us to nail the proof because it's a cask strength product, so it's whatever the barrels are yielding. Because it's a secondary maturation, even if we have the same base that we split across more than one vatting of Dovetail, it's usually going to lose a proof or two differently in the secondary maturation casks based on how that cask was functioning, what was in it before, and what was the proof, and then also what's the environment around it for the couple of months that it's finishing.
Right. I'm going to take one last go at my highly technical attempt at this. Oh, no, it's... Oh, yep.
Yep, there we go. You got it.
Yeah, hey! Who said technology was dead? So there is your 5.
I'm thoroughly impressed that you figured out how to do that on the fly.
That's how we like to do it at the Oak Barrel, running on just as it comes. But yeah, so batch number 5, everyone here is, or vatting number 5, sorry.
So we don't deliberately don't have a whole lot of control over what vatting is being sent. We know what the current one in our inventory is, but then there's different levels of time delay in different places. So for instance, the bottle that you showed and the picture that we have of this are actually slightly different colorations of labels. We did a label migration. The juice didn't change, but the label changed a little bit. And so probably the next time it comes into Australia, it'll have this blue on blue instead of blue on yellow label.
Okay, so what we're seeing on the screen here, this is the new version.
Yeah. And the reason for that was just so that we could streamline what the colors were saying about our different products in a way that made sense, so that the yellow bottom of the batches of bourbon is sort of signifies a batch product for us, and the two-tone of Dovetail Armida Seagrass signifies an evergreen 3 finishes product. It's another thing that I really learned from Joe that has taught me so much about thinking forward with a complicated set of I guess like offerings, that putting a syntax together, what we call a product matrix, where even if it seems very different, there's a cohesive way of organizing them, allows us to talk about a lot of things quickly. And that is true with the way that we talk about it, and it's why we use vatting instead of batch, but also we've started making sure that the labels fall into that same organization as well.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking flavor profile, it's creamy up front, then it's like really chewy caramel toffee lollies, on that palate, quite confectionery, almost a little bit Werther's Originals as well, but super drinkable, dangerously at 60 plus, at 120 plus proof.
Yes, Dovetail and Seagrass are both wonderfully dangerous products. Do you want to move on to Seagrass?
Yep. Let's do Seagrass next, which is this isn't a hard sell. This is an education night, but we're doing free shipping on every thing that has the word barrel with 2 L's on it in the store at the moment, apart from Seagrass, which is still it's on the water. So this one's coming soon.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just saved the absolute smallest amount for me to try tonight. We're out of this one completely.
I'm glad to hear that.
And this
I'm sorry you're out, but I'm glad it's selling.
Yeah, and I've tried everything else apart from this. So, and I resisted the urge, so I'm going in blind on this one tonight. This is my first stab at Seagrass.
Great. So Seagrass was the third and, at least for now, final release in our quote-unquote evergreen series. If Armida is somewhat a bourbon because of the base, even though we don't consider it that, and Dovetail is very much an American whiskey, Seagrass nods at the rye category. But like our batches of rye, it is a blend of American rye, which has very strict rules about cooperage, and Canadian rye, which is a little bit more variable in terms of what you're allowed to do with barrels. The base of this is a 10 to 16-year-old Canadian rye blend that is finished in apricot brandy casks. And to me, even though Dovetail will always have my heart as like the first really complicated whiskey that Joe really allowed me to be a partner in working with him on, Seagrass is the one that I drink in my house the most right now. There's on the nose and the front palate, even though you can tell there's a secondary maturation or a finish on it, it's very much it's a rye whiskey. There's the spice and the twanginess and the herbaceousness that you get from rye whiskey. As soon as you get over the fact that it's 118 proof, there's this moment in the mid palate that I think of as the zero gravity moment, where everything falls away except for that apricot note. And you get this one quick, soft apricot moment. And then it all rushes back to you and you're back into an 118 proof rye whiskey. Nick, who really, even though Seagrass is, of course, a team effort, Seagrass is really a project that she looks after. And her ability to get that movement from front palate to mid palate to finish, I don't want to sound too sales guy here, but it's the most impressive thing in the world of blending that's happened in the past year or two to me. Like, I cannot, not only the fact that that happens in this whiskey, but that she is able to find a way to make those separation of flavors each time we do a vatting of Seagrass. I just think it is, again, a pretty objectively easy, delicious thing to drink, even at 118 proof. But there's intellectual, how your palate responds to the molecules thing with Seagrass that I'm really proud of, and it's just fascinating to me. And it's, even though I got to work on the conceptual design, I know that I could never put these barrels together in this way that would do that every time. And because of that, we thought Seagrass was going to be not as fast a mover as Dovetail and Armida, because rye in general doesn't move as fast as American whiskey and bourbon does to us. And we have trouble keeping it in stock. We're allocating it out as fast as we can blend it at this point. We've kind of caught up. We have a good amount in our warehouse now, but we thought it was going to be an initial bump and then a slowdown, and it's been this summer really the thing that people are finishing the bottle and asking for another one from us most commonly.
I can't blame them for finishing the bottle. Super Moorish, and I think Ben Ingalls sort of sums it up in the comments there. The apricot finishes insane; it goes forever, and I 100% agree. It just keeps going and going and going, but because it's that sweet, luscious apricot, it also makes you go back to the glass straight away. So it's the finish that's, bringing you full circle. I loved the way you described that as that zero gravity moment in that palate. And I love with any whiskeys, and in fact, any spirits, you see it a lot in cognac and Armagnac, just these moments of clarity on the palate where a flavor comes through, and as soon as it's there, it's gone. So I'm actually going to nick that phrase, zero gravity moment. I've never described a whiskey like that, but that's coming home with me, that one. Miles, is looking at, so like, can't try the 16 years Seagrass. Is he hinting at a bit of a limited release or something there?
Yeah, so I'm going to actually answer a couple questions here. Ben Engel asked about the VAT numbers on Armida and Seagrass. Yes, we Easter egg in the same place for Armida and Seagrass that we do for Dovetail. Miles has, I guess, seen one of the blogs that found the leak, the cola leak of gray label Seagrass 16. So I believe last time we talked about the 15-year-old gray label barrel product, the BCS 15-year.
Yep.
What is happening this year is we used to just call that BCS bourbon, and we are changing the way that we talk about that whiskey a little bit. We're not changing the whiskey at all. It's now called BCS Gray Label Bourbon because we are expanding the offerings in that 3-pack gift pack line. Coming out this year, there will be a very, very limited, you know what, I actually have the spreadsheet open on my computer if you don't mind me looking at something.
Yeah, go for it. I'm sorry, I'm not just my Instagram, but the Easter egg on this Seagrass is much harder to photograph on an iPhone than the Dovetail one, because for people who can't see on that bottle, if I'm going to bring it up as the full size, it's actually it is like grass, and then just at the end there is the little number, but my phone is not picking up the blue and green as clearly as the Dovetail.
It's a little harder to find because the spline that looks like Seagrass in between makes it seem a little blurry, and the colors are not. There's not as much contrast. But trust me, it's there.
I'll give this a quick go. I don't know if this is going to work, but.
And so the reason I was pulling on my spreadsheet is because I see Brock ask too. I believe the allocation for Australia on Seagrass 16 is going to be 12 bottles for the country.
So that's good. So that's 10. That's 10 for me and 2 to fight over. So,
and our hope is to reproduce it, but Seagrass 16 was essentially a business answer to us being offered some very, very good, very, very expensive barrels at the beginning of this year, and us tasting them and saying yes, and then not knowing what to do with them because they didn't really fit into anything we were doing in the rye category. And Nick and I, very late at night when we were doing an exploratory lock-in blending session, had the idea of the finishes of Seagrass on the little sample of really high-proof 16-year-old rye, and it was delicious. And so that was the impetus actually for us creating this whole gray label line. There will be a 16-year-old Seagrass, and there'll also be a 24-year-old Canadian whiskey that is finished separately in XO Armagnac and Oloroso Sherry. And so they will be available in America at the end of this year. I would imagine they won't land in Australia until the beginning of next year.
Right. Excellent. I want to, before we move on to the next one quickly, but I'll ask a question. Will Barrell distill their own liquid instead of sourcing? Is that on the radar at all? Investing in a bit of kit?
I don't want to say we'll never do it, but we have very purposely abandoned all plans for opening a distillery. We really like working with well-executed, often old spirits from around the world. And so the amount of time effort and dollar effort that goes into creating a distillery that would need to produce at the volume that would make it worthwhile for us, we have decided that we just want to invest in barrels, not in a distillery. And so I don't want to say it'll never happen. I don't want to say that there'll never be like a stricter partnership in any way. But there's nothing on the agenda for us right now to do that. And for a long time, we thought there would be, but we feel like we've sort of broken out of the needing to migrate to producing ourselves. And in fact, we've seen some brands that started sourcing and have moved into their own distillate have a lot of problems because being a good distillery is a different skill than being a good blender or being a good marketing and sales company. And we know that we're good at the blending, and I have it easy from a sales perspective because the whiskey is really good, and so I don't have to do a whole lot when I represent it. Developing being a good distillery is a totally different thing, and it's not something that we want to concentrate on. We really want to continue to push forward the exciting and kind of difficult, no one's done it before us side of what we do as a producer. So there aren't plans for that at all. Vidal also asked about the flocking in Seagrass, which I don't want to give the impression that I'm ignoring that question. We don't do any chill filtration on any of our whiskeys. And what we find with especially the finished products, but occasionally some of the batches of bourbon and single barrels too, is when something, for whatever reason, gets below about 45 degrees Fahrenheit, which would, what would that be? Like,
don't look at me. Hold on.
that would be 11 or 12 degrees Celsius, I think. That's not right, but it's close enough. When it gets below that and then gets pretty quickly brought back up to temperature, there is coagulation of flavor oils that happens. And it doesn't always happen, and it is it's not always that exact 45 degrees, and sometimes it's the fact that it got brought down to the temperature too fast, and sometimes that it got brought up temperature too fast. But the reason that's happening is because those are molecules that have flavor, and we like them, and so we do not want to change anything in our filtration. We know how to prevent it, and we don't want to. So if that happens, just shake it pretty aggressively. I find if you're gonna drink it, the best thing to do is shake it, open it, close it, shake it again, and then it'll totally go away. Sometimes you need to like relieve the pressure to allow it to decoagulate. But we're doing what we can from a production standpoint to make it so that never happens, but it doesn't happen very often. I think it's probably more common in Australia because we have no control over the temperature while it's shipping across the world. People say things are temperature controlled, but like we all know they're not. Or they say they're refrigerated, but actually they go below freezing. That's the other problem that happens. And so it's not every bottle, but it is just going to happen in Australia sometimes. And we spent some time trying to figure out how to prevent it, and everything we could do to prevent it was affecting the flavor. So we stopped trying.
Yeah. It's a big issue with American craft beer as well. Obviously, you know, the Australian craft beer scene has exploded in the past 5 years, and the quality is exponentially growing. And therefore, we're seeing a lot less American craft beer being imported because, for all intents and purposes, you can pay the X amount, thousands of dollars for refrigerated storage, but it makes it very expensive here. And as you're saying, there's been many occasions where a whole batch of really great fresh IPA that's been expressed over that's here, you know, within a month afterwards, it's obviously not been treated right. So I totally, as a retailer that deals a lot in beer as well, I totally understand your issues there with bringing things in.
And I lost some sleep over it on like, what are we going to do? We can't be a company that has flocking and everything. And I think Joe and Tripp really sort of set it straight with it. First of all, we did all the work trying to prevent it. And then they said, we just have to do the work of educating on like how to deal with it and why it happens. Because my experience has been most people, when you explain to them that it is the things they love about it accidentally solidifying temporarily in the bottle, doesn't bother people so much anymore. What's difficult is when someone doesn't know that and they see it on the shelf and they're curious why it looks like there's some sediment at the bottom or things floating in it.
Yeah. And for those who aren't familiar with the term, that's exactly what it is. It's some sort of sediment in the bottle, but it's the natural oils and molecules just, figuring themselves out. Should we move on to the next whiskey, which I believe is the final whiskey? I'm doing my quick
the Infinite Barrel Project,
which I love. I really love this as a concept because we've all done this. Well, if you haven't done this, you should do this at home. And I've got a couple of barrels running now at the moment, inspired by this release since we last spoke. This is the ultimate whiskey nerds project.
So the Infinite Barrel Project is a world whiskey blend that we do. It used to be a 2,000-gallon blend. It's become a 3,000-gallon blend because we need to bottle it in slightly larger quantities than we used to. I refer to it as the exploratory anti-Solera, but I know that's a very nerdy way of saying something. Essentially, the goal of the Infinite Barrel Project is to have an underlying flavor profile, but to have the releases evolve as we evolve the project. So we take about 10% of the 3,000 gallon base blend out to bottle, and then we try to improve upon it with the 10% of space we have left. And sometimes that is by taking older versions of what is in there and sort of migrating the flavor profile into something that's a little bit more mature. And sometimes it's rebalancing with something that is very similar to what's already existent in there. And sometimes it's introducing new whiskeys completely. And so 10% of the blend changes with each bottling date. However, it's never 10% of just one thing. And so honestly, it changes by like 1 or 2% in terms of its recipe with each bottling date. We do occasionally go and open like 7 or 8 of them next to each other so we can sort of taste the progression. The ideal situation for us is that if you were to taste all of them, you might be able to put them in order because you can see the new layer being put on each time. And I think there's some streaks of 2 or 3 releases that you can absolutely do that. And there's some streaks where they taste similar but different, but it's hard to make it chronological without seeing the bottling date. We really love the project. It's something that's really close to our heart in what we do. But it is definitely the most malt forward, even though we do a blend called the American Vatted Malt, which is 100% malts now. Because they're American malts, there's not a scotchiness to them in the way that there is with the Infinite Barrel project. And so it's something we love, but it's not necessarily the best example of what most of our whiskeys taste like. And so we call the American Vatted Malt and the Infinite Barrel project, we call our malt series now, and it's almost like a separate portfolio within our portfolio.
Yeah. If anyone, when we could come and visit each other and that sort of stuff, you might have seen at the Oak Barrel here, the Infinity Barrel project actually sits in the Highland to Isla section of Scotch, as opposed to in the bourbon section of where it is. But I mean, so this is a big vat, and you pour whiskeys into it, and it evolves, and then you draw a little bit off, and you keep filling it up. I know with my barrels over here and my Infinity bottles at home, where I just keep topping it up, there've been things that I love that I've got the last bit of a bottle of, or things that I've just dumping in. When I move house, for example, there's a lot that gets put into Infinity bottles at that point of time. Are you sourcing whiskeys specifically for the purpose of this, or is it a little bit like, we got this parcel of casks and we got ideas for 90% of it, the 10% can go into the project? How do you source?
It is mostly the former. Things are sourced specifically for the project. I think sometimes people assume the Infinite Barrel project is our dump bucket. And it's not, because if you think about how much that 3,000 gallons of cask strength distillate is worth, we're not going to just dump something in there and see if it tastes good. There's a ton of testing that goes into each time that we formulate the Infinite Barrel project. That being said, there are ingredients in the Infinite Barrel project that are used in other things. And there are moments where there are experiments that are done that we like, but we only did one cask. And so we end up introducing it into the Infinite Barrel project because we don't have a specific commercial use for it otherwise, and we feel like it will work well there. So sometimes the test goes into the Infinite Barrel project, and then we enter for something else. So it's really all of the above. It's a moment where even though we're not introducing a new whiskey each time, we get to have a little bit of a blue sky meeting about what to do with that 10% that we can reblend each time to try to improve upon it. Also, because it is a world whiskey blend, there's so much that we can do finishing on other world whiskeys that we might not be able to do in anything else in our portfolio. And so a lot of times when we do a private release, for instance, and it was PX sherry finish, we then have a barrel that was a PX sherry and then a American whiskey. And so it has a little bit of flavor, but probably not enough to do another PX sherry finish. And so we'll take Scotch and we'll put it in there, and then we'll use it for the Infinite Barrel project because it allows us to get just like a twinge of interesting complexity on an ingredient that we know is going to go into the Infinite Barrel project anyway. So at this point, there's like 30, 40 different ingredients in that whiskey.
Yeah. So if for those, again, eagle-eyed spotters, we're looking at one that's July 16, 2018. The one we're actually drinking tonight is February 12, 2020. There's a great question coming up here from Jacob Hosking saying, would you do a non-peated infinite barrel project or region style specific? I know from my very limited experience playing with this, once you add even the slightest bit of peat, you can spend
it's there forever.
You can spend months and years trying to chase it out. So, I mean, is the infinite or this particular vat now peated forever, or?
Yes, in that, and we still introduce peated products into it. It's not terribly peated. It's about 25% of it is peated Scotch, and it's not a really heavy peat. I think it's like a 15 to 20 parts per million peat that goes in there.
So
to answer Jacob's question, we talk about that, but we call it the Infinite Barrel Project. And so if we were to introduce a analogous project in a slightly different category, we suddenly would have, from a execution standpoint and a not creating confusion that is hard to explain in the market standpoint, we've decided that we don't want Infinite Barrel Project as the name of a project to exist outside of this one specific whiskey. What has happened is the style of blending that started as Infinite Barrel Project, with the idea that it is going to evolve constantly but slowly, was a lesson that helped us when we were putting together our other brand, Stellum, where we do what's called a daisy chain blend, where we always leave a large portion of it to blend on top of so that we can recreate the flavor profile again. And so there aren't other Infinite Barrel projects within our portfolio, but there is the strategy of Infinite Barrel Project being used as the blueprint on how to blend in other places.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating little experiment. Do you just have the one Infinite Barrel going, or would you put two or three next to each other?
What has actually happened is we will put the Infinite Barrel Project into one of our very large tanks to blend. We'll add the 10% roughly. We'll make sure we like it, and then we will break it into 5 or so stainless steel totes, and one of them will get bottled. And then the next time that we need to bottle it, we will transfer from those totes back into the blending tank, reblend it, transfer back into the totes, and bottle one of the totes. And so it doesn't actually live all together anymore. And that's a logistics fix, that the vessel that we need to house it is now, we have so many different projects going on that we need to use that vessel as a blending tank for other things now.
Yeah. Sounds like you guys need a little bit more warehouse space.
Yes. I think the quick answer to that is absolutely yes. It's sad actually that there's certain things we'd like to do, and the limiting factor on our capacity changes depending on it. Sometimes it's availability of distillate, sometimes it's time, sometimes it's not wanting to confuse the market, and sometimes it's literally we don't have space in the facility that we are licensed to blend in to house so many things, and so we have a lot of offsite storage, but you can't really work with things when they're in offsite storage.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to take away from that is there's no lack of ideas, which is the most exciting bit.
Yeah, I'm enemy number one in production a lot, because Joe and I will talk through something and we'll want to do it, and then trying to figure out when and where within the facility is a challenge.
Yeah. Well, they don't call you the Chief Product Innovation Officer for nothing, mate.
I appreciate that.
Look, tonight's been fantastic, and we're drinking premium whiskies, and I think I'm going to echo my statement from earlier that this has been a premium virtual tasting in terms of a real insight into the way that not just how you make these whiskies, how you craft them, how you think about them, how the whole team sort of looks at whiskey and category as a whole. And I think that's really, really fascinating. So, in terms of a final question, unless anyone else throws something in the chat, you can sell everything you want in America. And as you mentioned a couple of times, you're struggling to keep up with demand there. Why Australia? What is it you see in the Australian market that you say, okay, well, this is an export market we want to give a little bit of an allocation to, as opposed to the probably 50 other markets that would be screaming for your stuff?
So we're in a moment now where, even though there's a lot of products like the Seagrass 16 when it comes out that we have to just offer people what we can and apologize afterwards, we are able to produce at the quantity where, if we need to carve out bits for other markets, we can now. And we're still a really small team. We like working with people that we feel like there's a cultural and ideological synergy with. And so, to be totally honest, the reason that we're in Australia is because we found partners that wanted to import us into Australia, that we felt confident that they would represent the brand with honesty and integrity. And so we said yes. There's a couple of random export markets that we exist in, not because we went there on purpose, but because we found the right partner. And so we are happy to send small or large amounts of whiskey to almost anywhere at this point, but we're not happy to send it to almost anyone. It has to be someone that we feel we're not in Australia. We don't know the market. We're not able to fix problems by ourselves. And so we had to find someone that we really trusted to do the work correctly. And I see in America, for instance, a lot of really amazing foreign brands get represented really poorly in America. And it creates a problem if they want to ever come in a bigger way, because they've ruined the perception in the market for themselves by not having an importer that treats them correctly.
Yeah, and it's actually probably a good segue to something I was going to say it tonight at the end, that the value of tonight's tasting for $49 for 6 of these drams, express posted around Australia. If you do the sums on all of the bits that go into that, there's not a lot going on there, and that's a big thank you to Awesome Spirits and Whiskey Hunt Australia and the team there that have really made this happen. And I think, I want to reiterate, what Will, you were saying there, that without those sorts of people supporting your brand, these sorts of things aren't possible, and this sort of education. So I think you've chosen very well in your Australian partners there.
I appreciate that. And I'd also add to that, to not take you and the work that you and your team does out of this too. Australia is a market that has a lot of curious spirits consuming drinkers in it. And so, and not a market that has its own really long entrenched elitist whiskey category. And so it's not that we specifically chose Australia for that reason, but I think that we found a lot of success there because we're doing complicated things and we're finding people who are interested in tasting those complicated things. And there's some other parts of the world that have very, very specific drinking cultures that might not grasp that as quickly. And so, yeah, it's really far away geographically, but I think in terms of what we're all looking for out of whiskeys, there's a lot of like-mindedness between the two countries.
Yeah, well, just on that then, as we wrap up for tonight, and thank you everyone for watching. Can we get on record now from you and anyone at the team at Barrell, as soon as borders open, as soon as we'll let you in, will you come down and come to the Oak Barrel in Sydney and do a tasting here? Go to some other venues in Sydney, go around the country and spread the good word?
So on the record, what I would say with the qualifier of as soon as borders are open and I can carve out the time to do it, I look at flights all the time just to earmark the amount of money it's going to be for me to get down there. I've been very lucky. I've been to 49 of the 50 states in America, and I've been to almost every country in Europe. I've never been to the Southern Hemisphere. And so I can't just pop in for a few days the way that I can in America, but as soon as it is really something that makes sense reality-wise, I very much want to get there for a couple weeks, and not just in Sydney, but in a lot of parts of the country, see all the great things that are going on there and meet you and other people that have been so kind to us in the past year.
Yeah, no, I think what you need to do, and obviously there's the East Coast, but I know Tasmania loves its whiskey, as does Perth. South Australia, and I think Darwin as well is often overlooked as a bit of a whiskey hub as well. So just right off a month, I reckon, and you'll be fine. And I'm putting the call out to everyone in the chat here tonight watching that if you can offer up a bed for a night in various parts of the country, to bring those flight costs down. That'd be great. Look, yeah, I want to thank you. Yeah, there you go. Someone who I'm going to say Ultimate DTM5, if that is their real name, has got a tent in the yard for you, ready to go. So,
looking forward to it.
Yeah, we get nice and warm. Thank you. Yeah, so Glenn, who doesn't typically follow bourbon, absolutely delicious from them. And I want to point at what Adam said as well, that you're the consummate professional. No question is off out of bounds and answering everything, but also just giving such a great insight into a different way to looking at whiskey that perhaps particularly in Australia, being a little bit further away, in the past 10 years, every bigger multinational brand ambassador has a team line, and getting away from that. Even when it comes to premium $1,000 bottles, there's a bit of a team line in that. So, mate, thank you very much. I appreciate it. What is it, 7:30 a.m. where you are now?
Yeah, it's time for me to. It's very hot in New York right now, and so I am gonna take a walk, get a nice coffee, and then start work for the day.
Excellent, mate. Thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. You've stayed up
anytime.
Stayed up late at the start of the year. You've got up early this time. I'm starting to think you don't actually sleep, which is good for people sending emails and that sort of thing. So, thank you very much. We'll say goodbye to everyone on the chat. We will be back tomorrow night with 2 back-to-back tastings. We're going to Asia tomorrow night. We're going to Japan and then to India for a little bit of fun. So we will see you all tomorrow for that. But Will, again, from the bottom of my whiskey heart and on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Goes both ways. Thank you so much.